Welcome to Anatomy and Physiology at Glen Oaks Community College. I'm Dr. Ren Hartung. For this video, we're going to look at skin histology. What you see right now is an image of thick skin under the microscope at 40 times magnification. And we can talk about the three major layers of skin here. This outermost layer is called the epidermis. This layer in the middle is called the dermis. And then below that, where we see all of this adipose tissue, this is called the hypodermis, or subcutaneous. Let's look at thick skin at slightly higher magnification. Oh, sorry, this is still 40 times magnification, just a different place in the skin. But still thick skin, and again, we can still see those three major layers: epidermis, dermis, and subcutaneous. We could talk about what these layers are made out of. The epidermis is stratified squamous epithelium that is highly keratinized. So it would be keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. The dermis is made out of mostly collagen fibers. It's dense, irregular connective tissue. And then the hypodermis, or subcutaneous tissue, is mostly adipose tissue. This is another image, again 40 times magnification, just to show it to you looking slightly different from a different angle and different lighting. And again, the same three layers: epidermis, dermis, subcutaneous tissue. Here's 100 times magnification, and we'll talk about a few structures here and some interesting stuff. Again, we have the epidermis, dermis, and subcutaneous tissue down here. And let's talk about some of the structures that we see. Apart from the layers, the majority of what I see here are sweat glands. These little tiny circles are sweat glands, collections of sweat glands. Sweat glands, these are eccrine sweat glands, and they are coiled glands. So in this area, for example, it's really one tube that is coiled up around itself several times. And in cross-section, that creates this look of multiple circles. The other related thing to sweat glands, do you see this really dark area in this part of the epidermis up here? That's where one of the tubes from a sweat gland is coming to the surface of the skin. The basic structure of an eccrine sweat gland, you've got this coiled sweat-producing region down here. That is the actual kind of glandular part that's making the sweat. And then there's a tube that goes up to the surface of the skin to deliver the sweat to the surface of the skin. Eccrine sweat glands also produce sweat, mostly to control body temperature, to decrease body temperature. So they secrete sweat when we're overheated. As long as we're here, let's look at the dermal layer and notice that there are parts of the dermal layer of the skin that project up into or against the epidermis. They kind of push up into the epidermis. Those are called dermal papillae. And the dermal papillae have two major functions or significances that I can think of. One of them is the dermal papillae projecting up to the epidermis has an effect on the structure of the epidermis. And in thick skin, that creates what we call friction ridges, also known as fingerprints. You can see that the surface of the outside of the epidermis here has these kind of waves to it. Those are actually fingerprints under high magnification. And that's created by these dermal papillae underneath that then affect how the epidermis grows and causes it to have those peaks and valleys that we see. For this image, that's probably all we can see here. Let's do a couple of quick review questions. What is this major layer up here? That is the epidermis. What is this major layer way down here? That's the hypodermis, or subcutaneous layer. And what major layer is here? That's the dermis. I'll do more questions at the end of the video. I'll have a whole sequence of questions to help you review. Here's another picture. Again, this is thick skin. The color is a little bit different, but all the structures are the same. And again, we can see the epidermis, the dermis, and the subcutaneous layers. We can see a sweat gland here, another sweat gland here, another sweat gland over here, a piece of a sweat gland down here. Let's move on to the next question. Oh, I'm sorry. As long as we're here, here's dermal papillae again and dermal papillae again. This is thick skin at 100 times magnification, and now we could start talking about the 5 specific layers of the epidermis. So up here is the epidermis again, and it has 5 layers. The outer layer, the outermost layer of skin, is called the stratum corneum, or the outermost layer of the epidermis is called stratum corneum. The next layer down for thick skin is stratum lucidum. Stratum lucidum. And then you can see this little bit dark layer at the top of this purplish region. The darkish layer there is called stratum granulosum. It has the appearance of having granules. That's why it's a little bit darker. And then we have the stratum spinosum. The stratum spinosum reaches from the stratum granulosum all the way down to the bottom. At the very bottom, we have a single layer of cells, basically, which is called stratum basal, also known as stratum germinativum. So to go through those 5 layers again, starting from the outside: stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and then stratum basal, or stratum germinativum. And then, of course, under that, we have the dermis. And while we're in this picture, let's see if we can see other structures. This is another sweat gland. Here's some adipose tissue. I'm looking inside of the, what do we call these again? Dermal papilla. There are receptors inside of the dermal papilla, but I don't see any specific to point out right now, although that right there looks like a Meissner's corpuscle or tactile corpuscle. Moving on to the next image. This is high magnification of the epidermis of thick skin. This is an even better picture to look at those 5 major layers. So let's go through those again. This outermost layer is stratum corneum. The next layer down, which is a little bit more translucent, is stratum lucidum. Then under that, you can actually in this image see the little granules inside of the keratinocytes here. That's stratum granulosum. Below that, we have this wide layer called stratum spinosum. And then all the way down at the bottom, we have stratum basal, also known as stratum germinativum. By the way, the reason it's called stratum germinativum is that there are stem cells down here that are undergoing mitosis in order to give rise to all of these keratinocytes. Over time, what happens is cells are added down here in the stratum basal by mitosis, and those cells contribute to the stratum spinosum. Sometimes those cells in the stratum spinosum are still dividing, by the way. But as more cells are added, the cells approach the surface. They go through the stratum granulosum layer. They die in that layer. As they move up, by the way, they add lots and lots of keratin. And they move up towards the surface. They die in this region, so they lose their nucleus. And that's why you don't see any nuclei up here in this region. All of these cells are dead in the stratum lucidum. And then in the stratum, I almost said the wrong thing, stratum corneum out here. And it is from the surface of the stratum corneum that those cells are lost. They get worn off of our skin over time. So the skin has to constantly replace itself. A lot of epithelial tissues have to do that, by the way. Anyway, those are the major layers, and probably more detail on this image than I needed. Moving on to the next slide. This is another high magnification image, so kind of quickly I'll go through those 5 major layers of the epidermis. stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, and this is a better picture even for stratum lucidum because you can see nicely that the stratum corneum is a bit darker, stratum lucidum is a bit more translucent. Next layer down is stratum granulosum, and then we have stratum spinosum, and then finally along the bottom here we have stratum basal, and the stratum basal is undulating quite a bit because of the dermal papillae that are coming up into it. Also in this image we have a receptor. This is a Meissner's corpuscle or tactile corpuscle. It's a sensor for touch. And I don't want you to think that this tactile corpuscle is inside of the epidermis. Only the tip of it is seen in the epidermis here. And what's actually happening here is one of these dermal papillae is coming up a bit sideways, and we're just seeing the tip of the dermal papillae with the Meissner's corpuscle or tactile corpuscle inside of it. The rest of the dermal papillae behind this purple area would be coming down and connecting to the dermis. So this is actually a part of the dermis coming up in here with this receptor inside of it. And again, this receptor is a tactile corpuscle or Meissner's corpuscle. The way to recognize it as a Meissner's corpuscle, by the way, the features that I'm looking at that tell me that that's a Meissner's corpuscle or tactile corpuscle, is that it is relatively oval in shape and it has these little kind of lines going sideways. That's what tells me this is a Meissner's corpuscle or tactile corpuscle. Another thing I could mention since we're here, can you see that there's a little bit of a darker shading down here in the stratum basal or stratum germinativum? The reason for that is there are melanocytes down here. Melanocytes make the pigment molecules that give us our skin color. The melanocytes make melanin, which is the color molecule or pigment molecule for skin and hair, and the melanin is transferred to the other keratinocytes, so the keratinocytes will have some of the pigment as well. Not a lot of pigmentation on thick skin. You may have noticed that yourself. The palms of your hands and the bottoms of your feet, that's where we find thick skin. They tend to be less pigmented than the rest of our body or the rest of our skin. Moving on to the next picture, also another image of thick skin at 450 times magnification. I like to show you several pictures of the same thing that look a little bit different so that you get a feel for the features. That's what I'm trying to get to. Outermost, again, is stratum corneum, and then down here would be stratum lucidum. Close to this next layer, which is stratum granulosum. And then we have stratum spinosum, and then finally stratum basal. And again, we have a nice dermal papillae coming up here, or dermal papilla because it's singular. And inside of the top of this dermal papilla, we have another Meissner's corpuscle or tactile corpuscle. And that's it for this little image. On the next image, this looks like thick skin at 100 times magnification. And there's a few things to point out here. Epidermis is up here, dermis is here, and then hypodermis is down here again. And we have sweat gland, sweat gland, sweat gland, sweat gland. This is another receptor. This is a receptor for pressure, for deep pressure. It's called a lamellar corpuscle, also known as a Pacinian corpuscle. And the way to recognize these is they are much larger than those Meissner's corpuscles we were looking at a moment ago. In fact, remember, this is a lower magnification. This is 100 times magnification. And those Meissner's corpuscles were up here, and we were at 450 times magnification, which made this little dermal papillae maybe look this big. So much higher magnification. These Pacinian corpuscles or lamellar corpuscles are much larger. And again, they're sensing pressure or deep pressure. Moving on to the next slide, this is that same receptor at higher magnification, and it makes it a little bit easier to see the layers that we see. The reason this is called a lamellar corpuscle, lamellar refers to layers, multiple layers. The lamellar corpuscles or Pacinian corpuscles that I see on my skin slides tend to be kind of ugly, although this is a kind of a pretty one. You can nicely see the kind of roundedness that it has and the layers that it has. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, and while we're here, here's one of the circles from a sweat gland that's nearby. This is another thick skin image. We're down in the hypodermis or subcutaneous area. And here's another one of those lamellar corpuscles or Pacinian corpuscles. And also in this neighborhood we see a sweat gland, another bit of a sweat gland, another sweat gland, and up here some sweat gland. There's one sweat gland here and another sweat gland. The next image is a higher magnification. This is 450 times magnification of that Pacinian corpuscle that we were looking at in the last image. And again, we can see that this is a round structure with multiple layers. And again, its function is to sense pressure. That's what lamellar corpuscles or Pacinian corpuscles detect as pressure. And I guess while we're here, notice that it's surrounded by adipose tissue. I think it's kind of interesting, if I go back to this last picture, in the textbooks in general, we're taught that we should find these receptors as well as the rest of the accessory structures of the skin, like hair follicles and stuff. They're in the dermis, sweat glands as well. But notice on at least the slides I have for thick skin, a lot of the accessory structures are down here inside of or very close to or in the border between the dermis and the hypodermis. I just find that kind of interesting. Moving to the next slide, this is another Pacinian corpuscle here, or lamellar corpuscle, but the way the section of tissue turned out, it doesn't really show the layers well, and you don't see the center of the receptor, so it's a pretty ugly image of a Pacinian corpuscle, but that's still what it is. And then also we see sweat gland, sweat gland, sweat gland, and another sweat gland. And of course the adipose tissue that we see down here in this lowest layer, the hypodermis or subcutaneous. Oh, in case you're wondering, these structures going by in this direction and kind of heading off in that direction, these are another type of connective tissue. This is, oh gosh, I'm tripping on it. This would be a form of dense connective tissue. Lots of collagen, that's the word I was tripping on before. These are collagen fibers going by. Remember, this is thick skin, palms of the hands, bottoms of your feet. It has to be very tough, so you'll find a lot of collagen fibers in these neighborhoods. If we go back to this lower magnification image of thick skin, there's a lot of adipose tissue here that also gives us padding to the palms of our hands and the bottoms of our feet. Moving on to the next image, this is not skin, but it's a beautiful example of this pressure receptor, the Pacinian corpuscle. This is actually from the human pancreas, an organ that's in your abdomen and that's involved with hormone production and also with some digestive function as an accessory structure for the digestive system. But anyway, the thing to look at here is the structure of the Pacinian corpuscle. Very round receptor with multiple layers. I tell my students it's got layers like an onion. And again, it's called a Pacinian corpuscle or lamellar corpuscle. On this next slide, we're looking at thin skin. So this is thin skin at 40 times magnification. To show you the difference, here's thick skin at 40 times magnification. Notice how thick that epidermis is. And again, the thickest part of that epidermis is the stratum corneum. And then we go down back to thin skin. The epidermis is very thin on thin skin, so that's why it's called thin skin, is because of the thin epidermis. And at least in the slides in my lab, the epidermis has a much thicker dermal layer. This is the dermal layer, and at the bottom of this image we can just see some adipose tissue showing the hypodermis down below. So again, the three major layers of skin in thin skin, we have epidermis on the top, dermis in this neighborhood here, and then hypodermis down below. There are also some accessory structures that we could point to in this image. These two purple circles are hair follicles, and at higher magnification you'd be able to see the hair shaft inside of the hair follicle. And then this structure below those two hair follicles, this is a sebaceous gland. And then down here we have a sweat gland, eccrine sweat gland. There is also an eccrine sweat gland, and up here is an eccrine sweat gland. Lastly, hard to see at this low magnification, but this is actually one of the muscles in here that creates goosebumps, arrector pili muscle or arrector muscle. So those are some of the accessory structures here, but the major thing for this level of magnification, at least for my students, is to know those three major layers: epidermis, dermis, and then down here where the adipose tissue is, we've got hypodermis. This is thin skin at high magnification, and now we could go through those five major layers of skin on, five major layers of the epidermis on skin. This outermost layer where you can see the flakes, that is stratum corneum. There's no stratum lucidum for thin skin, so no stratum lucidum. The stratum granulosum would be these cells that are just south of that stratum corneum. If I'm looking for stratum granulosum, I will use this pointer and put it just underneath the stratum corneum. And then next we have stratum spinosum. On thin skin, the stratum spinosum is the thickest layer. And then down at the bottom again, we have the stratum basal, or stratum germinativum is the other term for it. Notice that we also have dermal papillae here. Excuse me. But on thin skin, the dermal papillae don't really give rise to the kind of ridges that we see on thick skin. And I don't see, I haven't noticed on my slides receptors in the dermal papillae. I'm sure they're there. They're probably just dispersed. On thick skin, think of the fingertips. They're very sensitive, so we have a lot more receptors there. The back of your hand, thin skin, doesn't have as many receptors. You can still feel touch on there, but you can't feel touch as finely on thin skin as you can on thick skin. I guess before I leave this, let's go through those five layers again. Stratum corneum, no stratum lucidum on thin skin, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basal. And I could also talk here about pigmentation. We can see good pigmentation down here in the basal layer of the epidermis. And again, remember, melanocytes make the pigment molecules, and the pigment molecules then spread out to the keratinocytes. Moving on to the next image, this is actually higher magnification. That last image must have been 100 times magnification. This is 450 times magnification. It's an even better picture for looking at those five layers of the epidermis. Here's stratum corneum again, and remember, of those layers, there's one missing for thin skin, and that is the stratum lucidum. There's no stratum lucidum here. Stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and then stratum basal. And those are the layers of the epidermis. And then down here we see the dermis. And that's about all I wanted to show you from this picture. As long as we're here, see where that pointer is pointing? If I asked which specific layer is that pointer pointing at, what would you say? For me, by the way, I would say that that is probably stratum spinosum. Moving on to the next image, this is 100 times magnification of thin skin, and now we're starting to see those accessory structures a little bit more clearly. Here's a hair follicle, another hair follicle, here's a sebaceous gland, sweat gland, and sweat gland. And again, this structure here As we get to higher magnification, you'll see the individual cells of smooth muscle here. This is arrector pili muscle or pili arrector muscle. This is higher magnification. This is at least 100 times magnification of thin skin. And now we can see even better these hair follicles and this sebaceous gland. And we're starting to see at least the nuclei of the smooth muscle cells that make up the pili arrector muscle there. And again, we can talk about the major layers here as well. Up here we see we see the epidermis. And we can see the stratum corneum and the stratum granulosum and the stratum spinosum and the stratum basal, but not as well as we could at the higher magnifications. Other bits of things that we can see, this structure coming through here is probably a tube for a sweat gland coming up. This is another collection of similar stuff that we've already seen. This is at 100 times magnification, and we see a sebaceous gland. Sebaceous glands are always associated with hair follicles, by the way. This is a hair follicle, and now at this higher magnification, we can see inside of it, that little kind of yellowish structure is the hair shaft inside of the hair follicle. Another hair follicle with a larger hair shaft in the middle of it. And this over here is more sebaceous gland. And before I leave this image, way down below here, you can see the bottom of a sweat gland. Sweat glands are not always round, coiled things. They can also be elongated, I guess I should say. Also, while we're here, we're looking, the major layer of skin that we're inside of at this point is the dermis. There's no epidermis in this image and no hypodermis. So on this slide, I could ask, what major layer are we looking at here? What major layer of skin? The answer is dermis. This is a high magnification image of part of that last picture that we looked at. We're looking at this at 450 times magnification in this image. So we have a nice view of what the sebaceous gland looks like. And we have a really good view of hair follicle. And then you can see that little tiny cross-sectioned hair shaft in the middle there. Moving on to the next image, this is part of the same image again, I believe. Yep, it's this hair follicle in high magnification. So we see a nice hair follicle, and then here's that hair shaft again. And we can see a piece of the sebaceous gland that was south of that hair follicle. This is, I believe, high magnification of thin skin, and there's a few things we could look at on here. First of all, the major layer that we see up here is the dermis, and we're seeing the beginning of the hypodermis down below here. It's adipose tissue, and that lets us know that we're in the hypodermis. And this structure is a sweat gland, an eccrine sweat gland, and over here we also have an eccrine sweat gland. Let's see what's on the next picture. Also high magnification of skin and the same structures. We're in the epidermis. I'm sorry, this is not epidermis, this is dermis. We're in the dermal layer of the skin. And this is an elongated instead of a rounded one, but this is a sweat gland. And you can tell by the little circles, the tubes in cross section. And down here we have adipose tissue, so that tells us that down here is the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. And in case you care, that's a little blood vessel coming through. Another image, same structures in view. What's the pointer on? Pointer is on this structure here, and that is an eccrine sweat gland or sweat gland. What's the major layer up here? That's the dermis. And what's the major layer down here? Hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. Here we're in thick skin. Sweat gland at the pointer. Another piece of a sweat gland here. Sweat gland here. What major layer takes up most of the field of view? It's the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. And what layer is up here? The dermis. Moving on here, what receptor is the pointer on? That is on a Pacinian Pacinian corpuscle. It is a Pacinian corpuscle or lamellar corpuscle. What's the structure here? That's a sweat gland. Another sweat gland here, another sweat gland here, and here. What major layer are we inside of here? That'd be hypodermis, because this is adipose tissue. This is a nice image with a side-by-side comparison of thick skin and thin skin. Thick skin, again, is on the right, and on your body where you find thick skin is on the palms of your hands and the bottoms of your feet. Thin skin's on the other side. And we could talk about the major layers. Here's stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basal. Over in the thin skin, stratum corneum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basal. And then down here, what do we have? Down here we have the dermis. Moving on to the next image. This is a new slide to my lab. This is also thin skin, and it's from the scalp. So you'll notice that there's more hair follicles, and those hair follicles are larger, and the hair shafts inside of them are larger, because this is producing the kind of hair that we have on the top of our heads. This is low magnification, and we can see the dermal, the epidermis up here, and then the dermis, and then subcutaneous tissue down here. This is a little bit higher magnification. Now we can see the stratum corneum of the epidermis. So this whole area is the epidermis, and then there's the dermis. And we can see hair follicle, there's a sweat gland here. And there's what looks like a piece of a hair follicle over there. And down here we see adipose tissue, so this is hypodermis. In this image we see a nice sebaceous gland connected to a hair follicle. Hair follicle over here. A bit of a hair follicle here, and this is the hair shaft inside of here, rather large hair shaft. Sweat gland. Nifty thing about eccrine sweat glands, they are the type of epithelial tissue that lines them is stratified cuboidal epithelium, and you can kind of see that in this image. Another sweat gland from the scalp, and again we can see the layers of cuboidal epithelial cells here, so this would be stratified cuboidal epithelium. Oh, I forgot, my intention here was to ask my students, because this is a slide they haven't seen in the lab, at least not yet, but even though this looks so much different, you should be able to identify the three major layers of skin. What's this outermost one? The answer is epidermis. What's this one? Dermis. And then what's down here? Subcutaneous tissue. What is this structure here and this one over here? The answer is hair follicle. What is this? Answer to that is sweat gland. That's a sweat gland. Let's bop around here and do some other questions. Let's go here and say, what is this gland here? The answer is sweat gland, or eccrine sweat gland. What major layer are we inside of here? The answer to that is the dermis. And what major layer is kind of peeking in down here? That's the hypodermis. Another image here. What is this structure? The answer is sweat gland. I'm just going to randomly jump up to another picture. How about this one? What specific layer am I pointing at here? The answer to that is the stratum basal, or stratum germinativum. Kind of a tough one also. Look at where that pointer is pointing. What specific layer do you suppose that pointer is pointing to? I would say that that is pointing to the stratum granulosum. If it were pointing at the stratum corneum, then I would have the pointer up inside of this flaky material that is the stratum corneum. But this is just a little bit south of that, but not quite down into the stratum spinosum. So I would call that stratum granulosum. By the way, if I'm asking for stratum spinosum, I'll put the pointer down here in the middle of the stratum spinosum so that you're not confused as to whether I'm in the stratum granulosum or the stratum basal. I try to make it as obvious as possible. Jumping around again, let's see what we see. What major layer of the skin are we inside of here? The answer to that question is we're inside of the hypodermis, or subcutaneous layer. What receptor is in the center of the field of view there? What receptor is this? That is a Pacinian corpuscle, or lamellar corpuscle. What does it sense, or what does it detect? It detects pressure. It's sensitive to pressure. What is this structure here? The answer to that is this is a sweat gland, an eccrine sweat gland. And so is this one. And that's also what this is down here. And it's also what this is over here. Jumping around again, still in thick skin. Actually, that could have been a question. Is this thick or thin skin? Obviously thick skin. What specific layer is this? The answer to that is up here is the stratum corneum. What specific layer is the pointer pointed at? And that, I would say, is the stratum lucidum. During a lab exam, if this is what we were seeing, by the way, I would actually put the pointer up here to try and make it more obvious. But even down here, it's pretty obvious that that pointer ends inside of the stratum lucidum. And what receptor do we see here? The answer to that is a tactile corpuscle, or Meissner's corpuscle. Skip around a little bit again. Actually, I'll ask you, what type of skin do we see here? Is it thick or thin? The answer is this is thick skin. And as long as we're here, what major layer do we see here? The answer to that is this is the dermis. Could ask the same kind of questions here. What major layer is down here? The answer to that is the hypodermis. And then as long as we're here, what major layer is up here? That's the epidermis. What receptor is that at the pointer? That is a lamellar corpuscle, or Pacinian corpuscle. And then another question, is this skin that we're looking at? The answer is no, this is not skin. This is a pancreas. Here, what major layer of skin is up here? The answer is epidermis. What is this structure and this structure down here? And those are sweat glands, or eccrine sweat glands. Here, what specific layer am I pointing to? Answer to that is the stratum basal. What specific layer is up here? The answer to that is the stratum corneum. What is this structure? If you answered hair follicle, you are correct. How about this? Name this gland. The answer to that is sebaceous gland. What about this gland down here? That is an eccrine sweat gland. And here we are at high magnification. What is this little kind of brownish yellow structure inside of the purple circle? That is a hair shaft. What is the pointer, the microscope pointer, pointing at? The answer to that is a sebaceous gland. What is this little pigmented structure here? Answer to that is the hair shaft, or just hair. What's the purple circle around it? That's the hair follicle. I think we did that one already. How about this? What is this gland here? That's a sweat gland, or eccrine sweat gland. By the way, if anybody's wondering, I don't have any images that show apocrine sweat glands. The sections that I happen to have are not from the axillary or groin region. While we're here, what is this specific layer? Answer to that is the stratum granulosum. Stratum granulosum. And I think I've quizzed you on just about everything. As always, if there are any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section down below. And thank you once again for watching.